Hi, I'm James Thomas, your teacher, and I wanted to start with the video about Chinese isolationism. Earlier this past week or so, you guys learned about the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, and you looked into some of the stuff that is associated with his dynasty, like unifying the Great Wall of China, also creating his rather elaborate tomb, has rivers of mercury inside of there, protected by terracotta soldiers. It's an interesting time to be alive in China, especially if you're the first emperor, not one of the people that were forced to work on his building projects. However, after his time period and his reign, his dynasty only lasted about 14 years. After that, you have China moving into a whole series of dynasties, which, as you guys know, is just a series of rulers from the same family. That's what a dynasty is. Going to talk specifically about the Ming Dynasty, though, because the Ming Dynasty, that is taking place between 1368 to 1644. And it's during that period in time in which China really took a first big step towards taking its place in the world with these treasure ship voyages, these treasure fleets led by Admiral Zheng He. Now, you kind of got to say his last name as He, even though it looks like he. That is just a faux pas to say he because it is not how you pronounce his name. In any case, getting into his voyages really sparked a debate inside of China. And people were trying to figure out if this was the right thing for their country to do, taken center stage internationally, or if that was something that was leading China down the wrong path. Ultimately, they choose isolation. But let me help you out by sharing my screen and showing you this. Now, you should be able to take out your own worksheet of Chinese isolationism and be able to follow along and fill in some of this information. So, when I share my screen, you will be able to see right here, let me share it, Chinese isolationism. Now, you can notice up here in the corner where it says Thomas Key, it's not a key yet, but I do have this timeline up at the top so you can see what's going on. Now, magically, I will just go over here and change the fonts and everything comes around. So during the first emperor's time period, right in here, 221 BC to 207 BC. It's about 14 years. That's when the Great Wall is getting unified. That's where the things like the terracotta soldiers are getting built. Later on, you got the Han. A huge period of time passes here, about 1,000 years, and I just have a little teeny marker for it. And then it gets into when the Mongols had actually overtaken China and set up their own dynasty there. Please, no bad Mulan jokes. Oh, and I think the cartoon's going to be better than the real life one for sure. Anyway, the Ming Dynasty, where they really focused in on Confucianism, taking place from 1368 to 1644. This is where China begins its isolation. Now, the voyages of Zheng He over here. You guys have already read and had a homework quiz, or maybe it's just a regular old quiz. I don't know what you're calling them right now. I used to call them homework quizzes. I don't know. Talking about him. He was an admiral. Now, he wasn't that way because he was born into it. Zheng He is actually captured as a slave as a young lad and given as a playmate over to the emperor. Now, soon to be emperor is what I should have said, just to get a little teeny bit more specific. But it was not terribly uncommon at that point in time to create these kinds of kids that he could play around with because he couldn't do that with anyone else. He couldn't do it with servants. He certainly can't do that with other adults. So this was a way that they had solved that particular problem. Now, the emperor never really forgot about his childhood buddy and would make accommodations for his advancement in society. Zheng He was actually a devout Muslim. Because of the Silk Road and the connections that China had had with the Middle East and moving on over to Europe, China knew a little teeny bit about Islam, and there were plenty of Islamic converts, especially in the western part of China. They also knew a little bit about Christianity for that matter, too. So he is an admiral, and he takes these 7 voyages during the course of his time period there. Muslim admiral, 7 voyages during the Ming. Some of those voyages would have 200-300 ships. Sometimes they would have 1,000 plus, depends on which particular voyage that you're looking at. And these ships, a handful of them are treasure ships that are just immense. They are just gargantuan compared to anything that Europeans could produce at the time. Columbus's ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, are dwarfed by the size of some of these treasure ships. Now, these treasure ships can go upwards of 400 feet long, and they can have a lot of sailors on them. Now, it wouldn't be 30,000 sailors on just the treasure ship. It would be 30,000 sailors perhaps in the entire armada of ships that the Chinese were sending out. Now, these ships would have some specialties for them. So, for example, they would have ships that were just geared towards the horses, so that when China was making landfall at the various ports and points that it would dock in, they could put onto a battlefield an entire cavalry unit if they wished, or use horses for some construction projects that they may have done. They had ships that the entire point of them was to provide water, fresh water, drinking water to the other ships. And they had these elaborate systems of bamboo piping and pumps that they could transfer water from the water ships to the other spots. They had everything that you could think of in a mid-sized city on these ships. People for haircuts, people for teachers, men and women are on board these ships. They would even have women that were set aside to be gifts to the various kingdoms that they would go to, not necessarily as slaves, but more to get married off in order to solidify treaties and other kinds of agreements that they would go on. The Chinese emperor even wanted Zheng He and his fleets to go with every single bit of Chinese knowledge. And what are, in essence, some of the first encyclopedias were being created so that they could put the collective knowledge of China into these ships, so that if Zheng He and his crew needed to do something like build a bridge, they would be able to have the engineers look at the plans, be able to do that from the knowledge that they had on these volumes and volumes of Chinese knowledge that they had brought with them, these early encyclopedias. Now, if you're on one of these trips, it can be great and interesting, and you can have all sorts of excitement, but be prepared to be away. 3 to 5 years is the typical amount of time that you would have on one of these voyages. It took forever because they would sail southward from China through some of the areas like the South China Sea there on the far Western Pacific, and come around the Malay Peninsula and go on into the Indian Ocean. And the Indian Ocean is really where they spent most of their time being active. They would go to India, for example. Since Zheng He is a Muslim, one particular trip, he made sure that he set off into what is now modern day Saudi Arabia on the Arabian Peninsula, and made a stop as a pilgrim to Mecca, which is something that people of Islamic faith will still do to this day. His goals, though, weren't just simply exploring. I mean, that was kind of a side benefit, I suppose, but it wasn't his main goal. He wanted, and the emperor more specifically, wanted to show Chinese superiority, to let the rest of the world know just how awesome China was. I feel like I'm going to go into my Ancient Aliens guy and be like, awesome, but I need weirder hair for that. And because China was so awesome, they wanted to get tribute, which is a payment by a weaker country to a stronger one to show their submission. And those are the 2 major goals that are happening here. Now, don't forget about this last bullet down here. I will come to it a little bit later. But China, they had a whole lot of things going on. They also, of course, had the Silk Road, which, again, as Mr. Moose explained in one of his videos, is a trade route that connects China through the Middle East over to Europe. Is an active road from before the time of Christ, certainly all through Roman times, and even up to and including this period of time as well. But as seagoing vessels became bigger and were stronger, had more cargo space, it became much cheaper and much faster to send large amounts of goods by sea as opposed to using the caravan routes that they had used for the Silk Road, which is why starting around this time, the Silk Road is losing the importance that it once had. Doesn't go away completely, but it does actually get less vital a trade route than it once was. Whether it was on the Silk Road or whether it's on some of these trips that Zheng He had done, when it came to China, getting information, but also getting items, things, trade goods, products from other nations, there was a lot that China would trade away. I mean, no doubt, you think about the Silk Road. What's the number one item that gets sold there? It's going to be silk. Oops, I don't want to do them all yet. It's going to be silk. But China also had a whole lot of other things going for it. One of the most lucrative things was to get their porcelain and ceramics. Now, porcelain and ceramics, they're kind of cut from the same cloth. Think about pottery, but it has fancy glazes and things like that. No doubt somebody in the art department, like a Mr. Miller, would be able to explain that a little teeny bit better than the examples that I could give you. But don't forget, the Chinese were also the ones that invented the compass and had that going on. Now, this is going to sound like a bad joke, but it's absolutely true. A Chinese compass points south at this time. How in the heck did they do that? Yep, you guessed it. Instead of magnetizing the tip of the arrow that you would expect to see on a compass so the tip points north, they magnetize the other end where the fletching of the arrow would be, and therefore that part goes up towards the north, then the tip of the arrow points south. They just magnetize the other end of it. Doesn't matter whether the arrow is pointing north because the tip is magnetized or pointing south because the other end is magnetized. If you know which way one direction is, you can figure out all the other ones. They also had all sorts of medicines, tea, compass. They had lots of, well, mirrors, forgot about that. Gunpowder. And of course, with gunpowder comes your fireworks, comes your cannon. They even had crude early beginnings of guns. Think of it more as like a really, really small cannon or a really, really dangerous firearm. They had early versions of rockets. Their ideas of Buddhism and Confucianism. So, I mean, just like Islam or Christianity would spread one way along the Silk Road, you would also have Buddhism and Confucianism moving along the Silk Road in the opposite direction as well. I got this other column, and I'm going to get to that. But first, I want to get some of the things that the Chinese would get in return. Now, a lot of these are going to be European focused as from the Silk Road, but these would also work for some of the information and some of the stuff that they were getting from other areas. So, for example, one of the big things that the Chinese were able to get from Europe or other spots were things like fur, ivory, and wine. Now, the furs, obviously, all sorts of different animals being used in that. Ivory, elephants. That's where they're getting their ivory from. So sometimes they're getting it direct from Africa. Sometimes they're getting it through India. Sometimes they're getting it from the Europeans, and the Europeans had got it from Africa. Wines, very good European product that's coming on from there. Of course, just like Buddhism and Confucianism were traded, you also have good old Christianity that's moving along there as well. Don't forget about the standard kinds of stuff that people would trade for. They want money. So, gold, silver, gems, those kinds of things are coming along right here too. But one thing that the Chinese had, of course, that was in high demand for Europe was silk. But think about other kinds of clothing products. One of the things that the Europeans were able to get and getting on over and bring on over to China or some of the other places, India and Africa, was none other than good old cotton. It's a nice breathable fabric. And finally, not to be forgotten, think about one of those great areas of the Renaissance. I'm talking about the city of Venice. No doubt some of the smartest ones of you out there are already saying, oh my goodness, Venice is banking. Yeah, but already got the gold and the silver out there. Florence is even bigger for banking than Venice, but Venice had a little bit of it. Sea trade for Venice too, but glass making. Venetian glass was some of the best glass in the world. The Chinese strongly wanted to get, or strongly coveted the glass. They wanted to get as much of it as they could. Now, look at this list compared to some of the stuff that the Chinese had. They've got silk and porcelain, ceramics, a compass, different kinds of medicine. These are all products that take some brain power, some ingenuity, some fabrication. They really have to put in a lot of effort into the construction and making of these things. Whereas, a fur, yeah, you got some tanning, you got some scraping, you got to get the fat off, all that kinds of stuff. But furs are kind of a raw material sort of product. They aren't a finished item. Same deal with the ivory. The Chinese are going to get the raw ivory. They're going to be carving it themselves. Or wines, a little bit more process in there. Gold, silver, jewels, more raw material kinds of stuff. The Chinese are starting to feel like they're trading away these high quality resources, and they're getting more like raw materials in return. And it's not feeling so good. More on that in a couple of minutes. In the meantime, though, remember, there are two major goals for China to send out these treasure fleets. Number one, they wanted to show Chinese superiority, just like it says right down here, show power, wealth, and superiority. And they wanted to gain tribute. Tribute isn't really supposed to be a one-time thing. China wanted to go ahead and have these guys, Zheng He and his crew, have these nations agree to give China tribute, and they would give tribute back regularly. In order to do that, they can't always send Zheng He out there to pick it up. He's not a gopher in that kind of a sense of the word. He instead is this guy who's trying to show China's superiority. He's more than just a delivery man for tribute. The reason so many nations would give China tribute isn't just because of an actual trade, it's also because of these bits of knowledge that China can give. So, in order to bring tribute, you have to get from your nation over to China. You need a boat. Now, these nations could build little fishing craft and stuff like that, but big ocean going vessels, they don't have it. They're going to have to learn it from China. Ship making and ship building is going to be one of those things that the Chinese are giving over to these nations that are looking for tribute, looking to give tribute to China. So paper and printing comes around. All right, calligraphy, you might not need to know that in order to go sailing, but the paper and printing, you need that in order to create the maps that you're going to need to know where you're going. Shipbuilding, of course. Math for navigation and engineering. You're going to need to figure out how to go ahead and construct these things. You're going to need docks and dry docks and piers, and you're going to have to organize your labor force. You're going to have improvements to agriculture and irrigation systems to get all those people together in order to build these ships. While they're busy building, somebody's got to be growing the food in order to feed everybody, in order to get some surplus food, in order to put it onto these boats. This is the kind of stuff that China's giving away. And all of a sudden, this makes a whole lot more sense as for why nations would give China tribute. They're not just giving money to say, oh, you're better than me. They're given money, but they feel like they're getting something good in return. And that's going to be connections to China, access to information, and more knowledge. On a side note, I should say this too. Zheng He was, like so many people working for the government, absolutely geared towards trying to please his emperor, and who also happened to be his friend. And in order to do that, he was going to bring a really exotic gift to the emperor. He was able to convince an Indian leader to give up his most prized possession so he could bring it to China, and it could be part of the emperor's menagerie. Menagerie is just a fancy word for a collection of animals. And that's exactly what it was. A unicorn. He brings a unicorn from India over to the emperor. Now, the emperor was beside himself with joy upon seeing this thing. Now, no doubt somebody out there is saying, wait a second, Mr. Thomas, unicorns don't exist. I say, nay, nay. We just know them by a different name nowadays. It was a giraffe. They called it a unicorn, but it was a giraffe. Now, the guy in India had gotten it from a guy in Africa. The guy in India was reluctant to give it up, but he was convinced to go ahead and do so. They brought a giraffe all the way to China, stayed there for a number of years before it passed on. The political reactions and the social reactions to this are pretty big. I'm going to start with the social one and get to the political one soon enough. But socially, a voyage like Zheng He, remember how long it takes? That's right, 3 to 5 years. That voyage means that you're away from your family for that long. Now, some of us want to be away from our family for that long. However, don't forget, during the Ming Dynasty, look up there at that timeline. What did they practice? Confucianism. Confucianism is about filial piety. Fancy word for saying taking care of your family and your ancestors. How can you take care of your family if you're away from them for 3 to 5 years? And that is something that the Confucianists of the time really did not like. They saw these long trips as a violation of Confucian ideals. Leaving your family for too long was just not good. Up to the political, don't forget, I still do have a bullet down here. I haven't forgotten that one either. Up here on the political, I've already hinted at this once or twice, but those Confucianists that were in the government, they were starting to talk to the emperor politely and respectfully, of course, about how what China was giving up in their trade wasn't being made up for in the stuff that they were getting in return. So it was an unequal trade. China was giving up great stuff and in return getting okay, mediocre stuff, but it wasn't nearly as refined. Adding that, these treasure ships and the voyages that they went on were expensive. I mean, I imagine back then it's the equivalent of like the space race was for us back in the 1960s, and we were spending billions and billions on that. Nowadays, billions means nothing, but back in the 60s, that was real money. It cost too much. Heck, at one point in time, China waged a war on what we would now call Vietnam, just so they can get access to forests so they could cut them down to get the wood that they needed to build their ships. So it wasn't just about building the ships, it was also about the other costs that go on into it. The cost was skyrocketing. Added to all this, there's something else. When people think about China today, they are definitely thinking about an industrialized power, but China really wasn't back then. And there's two big reasons for it. One was really political and one social. So I was going to split them up here. But China wasn't an industrialized nation. If they were going to continue with great amounts of trade through these treasure ship voyages, they would need to produce more so that people could get the stuff that the Chinese were able to build. But China was a lot more interested in food. They have a huge population. So they put a tax on manufactured goods, but reduced taxes on agricultural farm products. Well, given a choice now, people are like, so do I go into manufacturing where there's a lot of taxes, or do I go into farming where there's fewer taxes? And farming became it. They changed policies. But socially, it was also something. And again, it goes in with Confucianism. Trade seemed to violate Confucian beliefs. Bear with me. Somebody who trades and is just a trader is usually a middleman. They get products from somebody, they take those products, maybe move them, and then they sell them to somebody else at a higher cost. That person makes money, but they didn't actually make the product. And the Confucianists were saying this is a violation of our beliefs, that traders are just supporting these foreigners and thieves. And that's a quote from the textbook too, supporting foreigners and thieves. Well, thanks for staying with me for this long. I still haven't forgotten about this. So now the emperor's policy, that starts to change. And here it is. They could have a policy of interaction where they could see a whole bunch of things happening. Now, if they decided to, they could continue these voyages and keep on trading with other nations. They would have to accept the cost. They'd have to accept the unequal trade. They could even consider industrializing. All of these things were on the table. But let's face it, it wasn't really realistic. The policy of isolationism, that's going to be different. That's going to be where he goes. And you're going to stop these trades with other nations. You're going to exhibit a little bit of xenophobia because of that. Phobia, everybody knows that's a fear of. But xeno, the X-E-N-O, beginning of it, is about foreigners. China's not scared of foreigners in the sense that they're like worried the foreigners are going to come in and take over or anything like that. It's just more along the lines of China sees itself as superior and the foreigners are less important to them. Now, when they do adopt this policy of isolationism, they're going to have fewer foreigners around. Not that it's ever zero, but it's going to be many, many fewer. And because of that lack of knowledge, well, a lack of knowledge drives fear, and that fear is going to get built up. It doesn't happen immediately, but it will happen over time. Now, not to be forgotten, of course, is the last little bit too, is if you choose the isolationist policy, it does please the people who are Confucianists, who don't like these voyages, which is perfect because they had these social reasons right down here. Long voyages violated Confucian ideas. Industrialization was a violation of Confucian beliefs, so they didn't want it. The Confucianists are happy. Now I'm going to tell you the one story that's not in your textbook or anywhere else that you might have seen, and here it is. Confucianists were part of the group of people that were known as the bureaucracy. And the bureaucrats are just people that help run the government. And these Confucianists took these really hard civil service exams in which the pass rate was 1%. 99% of the people who took these tests failed them. So if you were this great Confucian scholar, you could take the civil service exam. And if you were in that top 1%, you could get a government job. And that really would set you up well for really the rest of your life. So these Confucianists, they had to know Confucian ideals backwards and forwards in order to get these government jobs. Now that they have these government jobs and the emperor is having this policy of sending out treasure ships that seems to violate this Confucian belief, these scholars are in an uproar. They are upset. Now, what are the odds that they're just going to go straight up to the emperor and say, hey, emperor, your policy stinks and this is what you really should be doing? That's a quick way to get your head chopped off, or maybe get sent to some kind of a prison camp or something like that. Instead, they use their minds, because let's face it, they're smart and it's always better to use your mind. What is one thing that every emperor is scared of? All right, somebody out there is saying clowns. You're probably right, but that's not the right answer in this case. Yeah, every single emperor only rules because of one thing. They've got the mandate of heaven. And those Confucian scholars are no dummies. When, during the Ming Dynasty, the emperor was building what's known as the Forbidden City, there was a tragic bit of weather. And remember, bad weather, droughts, famine, stuff like that, could be a signal of losing the mandate of heaven. In the early 1420s, going through what's now the modern day city of Beijing was this massive thunderstorm. And the Forbidden City is built on a little bit of a higher bit of level than everything else. And of course, it has some of the taller structures in the city as well. So when that thunderstorm came through and the lightning was crashing down, lightning struck the Forbidden City and burnt a big portion of it down right as it was about to get finished. They had to rebuild it. those Confucian scholars are smart enough to say, hey, emperor, I wonder if that was a sign from heaven that your voyages are upsetting the gods, that you might be losing the mandate of heaven. That's something that the emperor is going to listen to. And the emperor is eventually going to make the decision to stop these voyages. However, because a dynasty is a series of rulers from the same family, emperors are a little bit worried that maybe if they just say, oh, I'm going to stop these voyages, that's not enough. If you stop them, they could restart again. Yeah, not if you do. Oh, this forgotten bullet right on over here. In 1433, that's the year that Chinese isolation begins. The ships get burnt, as do the logs. Those treasure ships are going to get burnt. This is why it took a long time for people, historians and archaeologists and whatnot, to find out about all these treasure ships and these treasure fleets. It wasn't until they actually unearthed part of the tomb of Zheng He, and they were able to see some of the stuff written on his walls, that they really started to find out more and more about his trips and his voyages. It was allowed to be written there because it was a tomb. It's not like everybody's going to it. But the ship's logs and the ships themselves get burnt. Those things are just gone. So, which policy did the Chinese ultimately choose? You had to have been paying attention, of course, at least a little bit, to figure out they are going to definitely be none other than isolationist. So what's going to happen as a result? And be specific. Kind of hard to do that in a recording like this, but think about what is going to happen. The Chinese have this technological and intellectual superiority compared to the people that they were coming to. Now they're isolating themselves. They're kind of resting back. What's everyone else going to be doing as the Chinese are kind of huddled in their own little alcove? They're going to be catching up. They're going to start to have other nations continue to make those advances while China stays stagnant just with the level of technology it already has. They're not getting new ideas. They're isolated. They just have the same ideas going around. The more you have interactions, the more you can spur on new ideas, the more you can advance knowledge. China is eventually, down the road, going to be forced to interact with other nations. And it's not going to be on the Chinese terms. All right. Thank you very much. I think it's time for me to sign off right now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, go right on back to me, and say, I hope that you learned something about China. Hope that you know a little bit of the reasons why it went into a period of isolationism, and hope that you saw the foreshadowing for when they get out of it. Thank you. Peace out.